A widow's secret hides in the shadows. Welcome to Shadow Code, I'm Thornwick. Tell me in the comments where you're listening. Your voice keeps these mysteries alive. The knock on the brownstone door was so timid, it barely rattled the glass. But the woman outside looked like she'd come to confess a murder. I could see her through the one-way panel Fritz had installed after the Baxter case, a nervous blonde, in her 40s, clutching a black handbag like it contained the crown jewels. Her coat was expensive but wrinkled, as if she'd slept in it, and she kept glancing over her shoulder at West 35th Street, like she expected someone to jump out from behind a parked Buick. It was 10 minutes past 11 on a drizzly Tuesday morning in October, which meant Nero Wolfe was upstairs in the plant rooms communing with his orchids, and wouldn't descend to the office until 11:30 sharp. The woman knocked again, a little louder this time, and I decided to save her knuckles the trouble. "Mrs.?" I said, opening the door. "Pemberton." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton. I need to see Mr. Wolfe. It's urgent." She had the kind of face that suggested she'd been beautiful once, before worry lines carved themselves around her eyes and mouth. Her lipstick was fresh but applied hastily, and there was a small tear in her left stocking that she probably hadn't noticed. "Mr. Wolfe is busy until 11:30, I said. "But you can wait in the office and tell me what's troubling you. I'm Archie Goodwin." She hesitated, looking past me into the brownstone's familiar interior, the red leather chair, the massive desk, the bookshelves that climbed toward the ceiling like ivy. "Someone told me Mr. Wolfe could help with delicate matters." "Depends on how delicate." Come in out of the rain, I led her to the red leather chair and offered coffee, which she declined with a shake of her head. Her hands trembled slightly as she set her handbag on her lap and fumbled with the clasp. "Mrs. Pemberton," I said, settling behind my desk, "why don't you start at the beginning? What kind of trouble are you in?" She glanced toward the hallway, as if checking for eavesdroppers. "I'm being blackmailed, Mr. Goodwin. Someone knows about." "Something I did. Something terrible." I pulled out a notebook and pen. "When did this start?" 3 weeks ago. I received a letter. No signature, of course. It said they knew about what happened in 1943, and if I didn't pay $50,000, they'd tell everyone. Her voice cracked on the last word. 50,000 was serious money, enough to buy a nice house in Westchester or keep Wolfe in beer and orchids for 2 years. "What happened in 1943, Mrs. Pemberton?" She stared at her hands. "I was married then. To Harold Pemberton. He owned Pemberton Steel. We lived in a big house on Long Island, and Harold traveled frequently for business. I was lonely. The classic setup. I kept writing and waited for her to continue. "There was a man," she said, so quietly I had to lean forward to hear. "His name was Vincent Carey. He worked at one of Harold's plants in the accounting department. Handsome, charming, younger than me. We began an affair." I'm listening. "It lasted 6 months. Harold never suspected. He was too busy making money from the war contracts. But then Vincent began asking questions about Harold's business, wanting to know about shipments and delivery schedules. I thought he was just making conversation, but he wasn't." She shook her head miserably. "Vincent was selling information to German agents. Industrial secrets, shipping routes, everything Harold's company was doing for the war effort, and I was giving it to him without knowing it. The plot thickened. Industrial espionage during wartime was serious business, the kind that could land someone in federal prison or worse. What happened to Vincent? Harold found out about the affair, not the espionage, thank God, just the cheating. He confronted me one night when he came home early from a trip. We had a terrible fight, and I told him everything about Vincent, including the questions he'd been asking." She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Harold put 2 and 2 together. He was no fool. And then Harold said he'd handle it. The next day, Vincent was found dead in his apartment. The police said it was suicide, a single gunshot to the head. But Harold had been out all night, and when he came home his clothes smelled like gunpowder. Now we were getting somewhere. You think your husband killed Vincent? I know he did. Harold was protecting his business, his reputation, and maybe even me. Vincent's death ended the investigation before it really began. The war was raging, everyone was paranoid about spies, and a dead German collaborator was one less problem for the authorities to worry about. What about the blackmail? Who knows this story? Mrs. Pemberton's grip tightened on her handbag. That's just it. I thought Harold and I were the only ones who knew the whole truth. Harold died 2 years ago, and I thought the secret died with him. But 3 weeks ago, this letter arrived. She opened her handbag and withdrew a single sheet of white paper. The message was typed on what looked like an old underwood, with several letters slightly raised above the line. Mrs. Pemberton, I know what you and your husband did to Vincent Carey in 1943. $50,000 will buy my silence. Leave. The money in a suitcase under the Manhattan Bridge on Friday at midnight. No police or the story goes to the newspapers. No signature, no return address, and the envelope, which she also produced, was postmarked from Grand Central Station. Have you paid? I asked. Once. I left the money as instructed, and it disappeared. But then I received another letter, asking for another $50,000 and then another. Her voice rose in desperation. I can't keep paying forever. Harold left me well off, but not wealthy enough to hand over $50,000 every month. I studied the letter again. The typing was professional but not perfect, suggesting someone familiar with office work but not a trained secretary. The paper was expensive, the kind sold at better stationery stores. Mrs. Pemberton, before we go any further, I need to know, did your husband actually kill Vincent Carey? She met my eyes for the first time since entering the office. Yes, Mr. Goodwin, I'm certain he did. And if this comes out, Harold's memory will be destroyed, our children will be scandalized, and I'll probably be charged as an accessory after the fact. The elevator's mechanical whirring announced Wolfe's descent from the plant rooms. Mrs. Pemberton tensed as the office door opened, and all 280 pounds of Nero Wolfe filled the doorway. He glanced at our visitor, then at me, and I could practically see his brain cataloguing details. Expensive clothes, nervous demeanor, blackmail case written all over her. Archie, he said, settling behind his desk like a mountain finding its proper valley. I trust our visitor has an interesting problem? I gave him the condensed version, while Mrs. Pemberton sat rigidly in the red leather chair, her eyes fixed on Wolfe's massive frame. When I finished, Wolfe leaned back and regarded her with the expression he usually reserved for a new orchid species. Mrs. Pemberton, he said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of authority, you wish to engage my services to identify your blackmailer? Yes, sir. I'll pay whatever you ask. My fee is $25,000 plus expenses. She blinked. That's half what the blackmailer is demanding. But I provide results, not merely temporary relief. A blackmailer who succeeds once will invariably return for more. The only permanent solution is to remove the threat entirely. You mean kill him? Her voice rose an octave. I mean expose him, Mrs. Pemberton. Once his identity is known, the balance of power shifts. Blackmail depends on darkness, illumination, renders it powerless. She considered this, then nodded slowly. All right, Mr. Wolfe. $25,000 to end this nightmare. Wolfe turned to me. Archie, the usual retainer agreement, and I believe some investigation is in order. I began typing while Mrs. Pemberton provided additional details. Her address on East 68th Street, the dates and locations of the money drops, and a list of people who might have known about her husband's wartime activities. It was a short list. Harold had been secretive about his business dealings, and most of his wartime associates were dead or scattered. After she left, Wolfe sat contemplating the letter with the intensity he usually reserved for a particularly challenging crossword puzzle. "Archie," he said finally, "what strikes you as significant about this correspondence?" I studied the page again. Professional typing, but not perfect. Expensive paper. Mailed from Grand Central, which means nothing since anyone can drop a letter there. Look more closely at the typing. I examined the letters again, noting the slightly elevated E and R keys. The typewriter has some wear, but that's not unusual. Consider the content, Archie. The blackmailer knows about Vincent Carey's death and Harold Pemberton's involvement, but notice what he doesn't know. I read the letter again, and this time it clicked. He doesn't know about the espionage angle. He's treating it as a simple murder case, not industrial sabotage during wartime. Precisely, which suggests our blackmailer has partial information, enough to be dangerous, but not the complete picture. That limitation may prove useful. Wolfe reached for his beer and took a measured sip. I want you to begin with Vincent Carey's background. Who was he? Where did he live? Who were his associates? Someone discovered this information recently, which means there's a source, a document, a witness, something that has remained hidden for 12 years. I grabbed my hat and coat. The rain had stopped, but the October air carried that crisp promise of winter that always made me want to walk faster. Vincent Carey had been dead since 1943, but in my experience, dead men had a way of leaving trails that led to very live problems. My first stop was the morgue at the New York Public Library, where I spent 2 hours digging through 1943 newspapers. Looking for coverage of Carey's death, I found a small item in the Herald Tribune, buried on page 6. Accountant found dead in apartment. Vincent Carey, 34, an accountant employed by Pemberton Steel Corporation, was found dead in his West Side apartment yesterday from an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound. Police said Carey had been despondent over personal financial problems. He is survived by a sister in Philadelphia. That was it. 3 sentences in a city where suicide barely rated more attention than a traffic accident. But it gave me a starting point: the sister in Philadelphia. The phone book yielded no Vincent Carey listings, but information found a Mary Carey Walsh in Philadelphia's Germantown district. I called her from a booth outside the library. "Mrs. Walsh? This is Archie Goodwin from New York. I'm investigating some matters related to your brother Vincent's death in 1943. A long pause. "Vincent's been dead 12 years, Mr. Goodwin. What's to investigate?" Her voice had the flat, defensive tone people develop when they've been hurt too often. "I'm working for a private client who may have information about your brother's case. Would it be possible to meet with you?" "Are you a police officer?" "No, ma'am. I work for a private investigator named Nero Wolfe. We believe your brother's death may not have been suicide." Another pause, longer this time. "Mr. Goodwin, I always knew Vincent didn't kill himself. He wasn't the type. But the police weren't interested in hearing that from his sister. Would you be willing to discuss it? I could drive down to Philadelphia this afternoon." "All right, I live at 412 Carpenter Street, but I warn you, I don't know much about Vincent's life in New York. He was secretive about his work." The drive to Philadelphia took 3 hours through gray autumn landscape that matched my mood. Mary Walsh lived in a narrow row house with a postage stamp front yard and lace curtains in the windows. She was a thin woman in her 50s with Vincent's dark eyes and a permanent expression of suspicion. "Come in," she said, leading me into a parlor that smelled of furniture polish and old grief. "I suppose you want coffee?" I accepted, partly out of politeness and partly because I was curious about what she might reveal once she relaxed. She returned with a tray and settled into a chair across from me. "Tell me about Vincent," I said. He was always the smart one. "In our family," she began, stirring sugar into her coffee. "Good with numbers, ambitious. When he got that job with Pemberton Steel, he was so proud. Finally working for a big company, making good money. Did he talk about his work? Not much. He said he was doing important things for the war effort, helping track production and shipments. But about 6 months before he died, he started acting. Strange. Strange how? Mrs. Walsh set down her cup and stared out the window. He got nervous, jumpy. Started asking me questions about our family background, whether we had any relatives in Germany. We're Irish, Mr. Goodwin, our grandparents. Came from County Cork, not Munich. But Vincent seemed worried about it. That was interesting. Did he mention anyone specific from work? Friends, enemies, romantic interests? A flush crept up her neck. Vincent was a good-looking man, Mr. Goodwin. The ladies liked him, but he was secretive about his personal life. The only thing I knew for sure was that he'd gotten involved with someone he shouldn't have. How do you know that? Because the last time I saw him alive, about 2 weeks before he died, he came down here in a panic, said he'd made a terrible mistake, that he'd gotten involved with the wrong people, and now he was in real danger. He gave me this. She rose, and went to a mahogany secretary in the corner, returning with a manila envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered with Vincent's handwriting. Names, dates, dollar amounts, and what looked like shipping schedules. He said if anything happened to him, I should give this to the FBI, Mrs. Walsh continued. But when the police said it was suicide, I didn't know what to do. Vincent said there were powerful people involved, people who could make problems disappear. I studied the document. Most of the names meant nothing to me, but one jumped out. H. Pemberton. The amounts were substantial, 50,000 here, 30,000 there, all dated between March and August 1943. Mrs. Walsh, did Vincent ever mention a woman named Eleanor? Pemberton? Her face darkened. He never mentioned her by name, but I knew there was someone. A married woman, someone he was crazy about. He said she was unhappy that her husband ignored her. I told him married women meant trouble, but Vincent never listened to advice. Did the police ask you about any of this? They asked a few questions, but they'd already made up their minds. Young man kills himself over money troubles. Case closed. They didn't want to hear about mysterious documents or powerful enemies. I photographed Vincent's notes with a small camera I kept for such occasions, then returned the original to Mrs. Walsh. One more question. Have you heard from anyone recently asking about Vincent? Letters, phone calls, visitors? Funny you should ask. About a month ago, a man called asking about Vincent's personal effects, said he was writing a book about the war and wanted to include a chapter about workers who died tragically. I told him Vincent didn't leave much behind, but he kept pressing for details about papers or documents Vincent might have kept. Did he give you a name? He said his name was Johnson, but it sounded fake, and his voice... She paused, thinking. He sounded educated but nervous, like he was reading from a script. I thanked Mrs. Walsh and drove back to New York as the sun set over the Jersey marshlands. Vincent Carey's notes suggested he'd been involved in something bigger than a simple affair, industrial espionage during wartime with substantial money, changing hands. But the key question remained. Who else knew about these documents and who was using that knowledge to blackmail Eleanor Pemberton? Wolfe was in the office when I arrived, working his way through a crossword puzzle with the concentration of a brain surgeon. I gave him a full report on my Philadelphia expedition, including Mrs. Walsh's story about the mysterious caller. So, our blackmailer has been researching Vincent Carey's background, Wolfe said when I finished. That suggests this isn't a random discovery, but a deliberate investigation. Someone has been digging into the past for a specific purpose. But why wait 12 years? If someone knew about Harold Pemberton's role in Vincent's death, why not act earlier? Perhaps because Harold was alive and potentially dangerous. Now that he's dead, our blackmailer feels safe to proceed. Wolfe set down his pen and regarded me with what I'd learned to recognize as his thinking expression. Archie, I want you to investigate Harold Pemberton's business associates, particularly anyone who might have access to old records. Also, check with Inspector Kramer about the original police investigation of Vincent's death. The next morning, I started with Inspector Kramer at police headquarters. Kramer was a solid cop who'd worked with us on enough cases to trust Wolfe's judgment, even when it annoyed him. Vincent Carey. Kramer pulled out a cigarette and lit it with the deliberate movements of a man who'd given up trying to quit. That's going back a ways, Archie. What's Wolfe's interest in a 12-year-old suicide? Client confidentiality, Inspector. But we have reason to believe it might not have been suicide. Kramer laughed without humor. Join the club. I was a detective. Sergeant then, and I caught the case. Everything about it stank. The gun was clean, no prints except the victim's, and he was shot behind the right ear with his left hand. Try that sometime and see how natural it feels. Why wasn't it investigated as a homicide? Politics, pure and simple. Word came down from upstairs that Vincent Carey was involved in some kind of federal investigation, and we were to close the case quickly and quietly. Nobody wanted to dig too deep into wartime espionage during the middle of the war. Who gave the order? Deputy Commissioner Morrison, who's been dead for 8 years. But the federal angle came from the FBI. I remember because Agent Peterson came by personally to collect all the evidence and files. I made a note of Peterson's name. What about the crime scene? Anything unusual besides the gun? The apartment had been searched professionally. Drawers were opened and closed carefully. Papers were neat but clearly disturbed. Someone was looking for something specific before or after Carey died. Ever find out what? Kramer shook his head. Like I said, the feds took over, but I always figured it had to do with Carey's job at Pemberton Steel. That company was making serious money from defense contracts, and there were rumors about security leaks. I left police headquarters with more questions than answers, but at least I had a lead. Agent Peterson. The FBI office on Foley Square was as welcoming as a morgue in January, but eventually I convinced a receptionist to check their personnel, records. Peterson had died in 1947, but his supervisor, Agent William Brennan, was now retired and living in Queens. Brennan lived in a modest house in Flushing with a small garden he was preparing for winter. He was a lean man in his 60s, with grey hair and the careful eyes of someone who'd spent a career dealing with liars and criminals. Vincent Carey, he said, after I explained my interest. Now there's a name from the past. What's your angle? Mr. Goodwin? I'm working for a private client who believes Carey was murdered. The police seem to agree it wasn't suicide. They're right. Peterson and I investigated that case thoroughly, and Vincent Carey was definitely killed by someone else, but we were ordered to keep it quiet. Why? Brennan gestured toward a pair of lawn chairs, and we sat down in the pale October sunshine. Carey was working for us, he said simply. He'd been recruited about 8 months before his death to help us investigate suspected German espionage activities at defense contractors. The pieces were starting to fit together. So he was a federal agent, not a spy? Not exactly an agent, more like an informant. Vincent had discovered that someone at Pemberton Steel was passing information to German contacts. We asked him to help gather evidence by identifying the source and documenting the transfers. Did he succeed? Too well. Vincent discovered that Harold Pemberton himself was involved in the espionage ring, along with several other prominent businessmen. They were selling military production schedules and shipping information to German agents who passed it along. To U-boat commanders, I felt like I'd been hit with a sledgehammer. Harold Pemberton wasn't the patriotic war profiteer his widow believed. He was a traitor who'd been selling out American sailors and soldiers. What happened? I asked. Vincent gathered enough evidence to destroy Pemberton and his associates, but before we could arrest them, Vincent was killed. The murder was made to look like suicide, and when we tried to pursue the case, we were told to drop it. By who? Brennan's expression hardened. People higher up the food chain than Peterson or me. Officially, the investigation was closed due to insufficient evidence. Unofficially, we were told that prosecuting prominent businessmen for espionage during wartime would damage morale and hurt the war effort. So Pemberton got away with it? For a while. But justice has a way of catching up with people. About 6 months after Vincent's death, Harold Pemberton's luck ran out. A German U-boat, using information Pemberton had provided, torpedoed 3 American merchant ships in a convoy. One of those ships was carrying Pemberton's own son. His boy was a merchant marine officer, and he went down with his vessel. The irony was bitter enough to taste. Harold Pemberton had betrayed his country and inadvertently caused his own son's death. Pemberton never knew his information led to his son's death, Brennan continued. But the guilt ate at him anyway. He became paranoid, started drinking heavily, and gradually withdrew from the espionage network. By 1944, he was out of the game entirely. What about the other conspirators? Most of them were quietly arrested or disappeared after the war. A few fled to South America, but Pemberton was left alone, partly because his son's death was considered punishment enough, and partly because he'd stopped cooperating with the Germans. I thanked Brennan and drove back to Manhattan with my head spinning. Eleanor Pemberton's story had been exactly backward. Her husband wasn't a patriot who killed a spy, but a traitor who murdered a federal informant. The blackmailer knew something, but apparently not the whole truth. Wolfe was waiting in the office with his afternoon beer and an expression that suggested he'd reached some conclusions of his own. "Archie," he said, as I recounted my conversation with Agent Brennan, "you've confirmed what I suspected. Mrs. Pemberton has been living with a false narrative for 12 years. Should we tell her the truth? Eventually. But first we must identify her blackmailer. The revelation about Harold Pemberton's actual role suggests our tormentor has access to wartime records, FBI files, military documents, or corporate archives. Someone with government connections, or someone who acquired such records through other means. Consider this. Vincent Carey's sister mentioned that someone called asking about her brother's papers. That suggests our blackmailer has been methodically researching the case. I poured myself a glass of milk and settled into my desk chair. So we're looking for someone who discovered Vincent's connection to the Pembertons, but doesn't know about Harold's espionage activities? Precisely. Someone with partial information who has chosen to exploit it for financial gain rather than expose it publicly. The phone rang, interrupting our discussion. It was Mrs. Pemberton, and her voice carried a note of panic. "Mr. Goodwin, I've received another letter. This one is different, more threatening. Can I come over right away?" 20 minutes later, she was back in the red leather chair, clutching a new envelope with shaking hands. This letter was typed on the same machine as the first, but the tone was sharper. "Mrs. Pemberton, your last payment was late. I'm losing patience with your delays. Unless you deliver $100,000 to the same location by Friday night, I'll take my story to the Herald Tribune. Their crime reporter would love to hear about Harold Pemberton's wartime murder." The demand had doubled, and the deadline was only 3 days away. "I can't raise $100,000 that—" "Quickly," Mrs. Pemberton said, dabbing at her eyes. "Most of my money is tied up in investments and real estate." "Mrs. Pemberton," Wolfe said gently, "there are facts about your late husband that you should know before we proceed further." He proceeded to explain what I'd learned from Agent Brennan, watching her face change from confusion to disbelief to horror. When he finished, she sat in stunned silence for several minutes. "Harold was a spy?" she whispered finally. "A traitor?" "Yes. And Vincent Carey was working with the FBI to expose him when your husband had him killed. But that means—" She stopped, working through the implications. That means I was sleeping with the enemy of the man I was married to, the man who was betraying our country. It was a hell of a thing to discover about your dead husband, but Mrs. Pemberton was made of stronger stuff than I'd initially thought. After a few minutes of shock, she straightened in her chair and looked directly at Wolfe. Mr. Wolfe, I want this blackmailer caught and prosecuted, not just to protect my reputation, but because Harold doesn't deserve to have his crimes covered up any longer. Very well, Archie. I believe it's time to set a trap for our blackmailer. The plan Wolfe outlined was simple, but required precise timing. Mrs. Pemberton would prepare a suitcase with fake money, newspaper bundles wrapped to look like cash, and deliver it to the drop site under the Manhattan Bridge as instructed. I would be watching from concealment to identify whoever picked up the payment. But what if he discovers the money is fake? Mrs. Pemberton asked. He won't have time, Wolfe said, because immediately after you make the drop, Archie will follow. Him, and we'll have Inspector Kramer's men waiting to make an arrest. It sounded good in theory. In practice, stakeouts under bridges in October are cold, uncomfortable, and full of unexpected complications. Friday night arrived with a fine drizzle that made the city lights blur into impressionist smudges. I positioned myself behind a concrete pillar, about 50 yards from the designated drop point, a trash barrel near the bridge's Manhattan approach. Mrs. Pemberton arrived at 11:45, looking appropriately nervous as she placed a black suitcase next to the barrel and walked quickly away. For 20 minutes nothing happened except increasing dampness and the occasional rumble of traffic overhead. Then at 12:15, a figure emerged from the shadows near the bridge's base, a man in a dark coat and hat, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who knew he was committing a crime. He approached the suitcase cautiously, looking around for watchers before picking it up and heading back toward the street. I followed at a distance, staying in the shadows as he walked north toward the financial district. The man was medium height and build, nothing distinctive about him except a slight limp in his left leg. He moved like someone familiar with the area, taking shortcuts through alleys and side streets that only a local would know. After 6 blocks, he stopped at a phone booth and made a call that lasted less than a minute. Then he continued north until he reached a small office building on Pine Street. Using a key, he let himself into the lobby and took the elevator to the 3rd floor. I waited 5 minutes, then followed him up. The 3rd floor housed several small businesses, an accountant, a lawyer, a private detective agency, and something called Consolidated Research Services. Light showed under the door of the research company's office. I took the stairs back down and called Inspector Kramer from a nearby diner, giving him the address and asking for backup. Then I returned to the building and waited. 20 minutes later, Kramer arrived with 2 detectives and a warrant. We took the elevator back to the 3rd floor, and this time I could hear voices from behind the research company's door, 2 men arguing in heated whispers. "Police!" Kramer announced, pushing open the door with his shoulder. The office was small and cluttered, with filing cabinets lining the walls and a desk covered with papers. 2 men stood frozen in the middle of the room, one holding the suitcase Mrs. Pemberton had dropped, the other clutching what looked like a thick file folder. I recognized neither of them, but the man with the suitcase was definitely our blackmailer. Same height, same limp, same dark coat. "Gentlemen," Kramer said, drawing his gun, "you're under arrest for extortion. Put your hands where I can see them." The blackmailer, a thin man in his 40s with nervous eyes, immediately raised his hands and started babbling about lawyers and constitutional rights. His companion, an older man with grey hair and expensive clothes, remained silent, but his face had gone pale. "I'm Inspector Kramer, NYPD. You 2 are going to answer some questions about Eleanor Pemberton and Vincent Carey." The thin man's face crumpled. "It wasn't my idea," he said, pointing at his companion. "He's the one who found the files. I just typed the letters." "Shut up, Tommy," the older man snapped. Mr. Tommy what? Kramer asked. Thomas Kellerman, the younger man said miserably. I worked here. This is my boss, Mr. Garrett. I studied the older man more carefully. He had the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, and his clothes suggested money and position. Mr. Garrett, what's your first name? James, he replied stiffly. James Garrett, and I want to call my lawyer. You'll get your call, Kramer said, but first let's see what's in that file folder. The folder contained photocopies of FBI documents, police reports, and what looked like Vincent Carey's original notes about Harold Pemberton's espionage activities. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to research the case thoroughly. Where did you get these documents? I asked Garrett. He remained silent, but Tommy Kellerman was eager to talk. Mr. Garrett has contacts everywhere. Government agencies, police departments, corporate archives. He runs background checks for insurance companies and law firms. When Mrs. Pemberton hired us to investigate her late husband's business associates, Mr. Garrett discovered all this stuff about the murder and espionage. The picture was becoming clearer. Eleanor Pemberton hired you. 6 months ago, Kellerman continued. She was settling her husband's estate and wanted to make sure there weren't any hidden liabilities or scandals that could affect her inheritance. Mr. Garrett found the Vincent Carey connection and realized what it meant. I looked at Garrett. So instead of giving your client the information she paid for, you decided to blackmail her with it? She was better off not knowing, Garrett said defensively. Harold Pemberton was a war hero in her eyes. Why destroy that memory? Because she was paying you to find the truth, not to decide what she could handle. Kramer had heard enough. He cuffed both men and read them their rights, then called for a wagon to transport them to headquarters. As they were being led away, Garrett turned back to me. You don't understand, Goodwin. Harold Pemberton destroyed lives. My brother was on one of those merchant ships that got torpedoed because of information Pemberton provided to the Germans. This was justice. No, I said. This was greed. If you wanted justice, you should have exposed Pemberton publicly instead of extorting his widow. The next morning, I gave Wolfe a full report over breakfast in the kitchen. Fritz had prepared one of his magnificent cheese omelettes, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the brownstone with domestic contentment. So, James Garrett was motivated by both greed and revenge, Wolfe observed, cutting into his omelette with surgical precision. A dangerous combination. What do we tell Mrs. Pemberton about her husband? The truth, as promised. She hired us to end the blackmail, and she deserves to know what she was being blackmailed about. Mrs. Pemberton arrived at 11:30, looking more composed than I'd seen her since this whole business began. The arrest of her blackmailers had obviously lifted a weight from her shoulders, but I knew that was about to change. Wolfe explained the full scope of her husband's wartime activities with his usual directness, sparing no details about the espionage, the betrayal, or the connection to their son's death. Mrs. Pemberton listened in silence, her face growing paler with each revelation. Harold caused our son's death, she asked finally, indirectly. He provided information that enabled German U-boats to attack American shipping. One of those attacks killed your son. She sat quietly for several minutes, processing the enormity of what she'd learned. Mr. Wolfe, I need to ask you something. If this information becomes public, what will happen to Harold's reputation, to our family's name? That depends on what you choose to do with it. Garrett and Kellerman will likely plead guilty to extortion charges, and their trial may bring some of these facts to light. But the full extent of Harold's activities need not become public knowledge unless you decide to reveal them. Mrs. Pemberton stood and walked to the window, gazing out at West 35th Street. For 12 years, I've lived with the guilt of thinking I caused Vincent Carey's death by betraying his whereabouts to Harold. Now I discover that Vincent was trying to expose Harold's treason, and Harold killed him to protect his own criminal activities. She turned back to face us. "Mr. Wolfe, I want you to help me do something. I want to clear Vincent Carey's name publicly and acknowledge what my husband really was. Vincent died trying to serve his country, and he deserves to be remembered as a hero, not as a suicide or a spy." Wolfe nodded approvingly. "A commendable decision, Mrs. Pemberton. Justice delayed is still justice." "There's one more thing," she continued. "James Garrett mentioned that his brother died on one of those merchant ships. I want to find out who else was affected by Harold's betrayal and see if there's anything I can do to help their families." That afternoon I spent several hours at the public library researching the merchant ships that had been torpedoed, using information Harold Pemberton had provided. The ships were the Liberty Belle, the Atlantic Dawn, and the Merchant Prince. Together they had carried 127 officers and crew members, of whom only 23 survived. Among the dead was Robert Pemberton, aged 22, third officer aboard the Liberty Belle. Also killed was Seaman First Class Michael Garrett, aged 19, James Garrett's younger brother. The irony was almost too bitter to contemplate. Harold Pemberton's treason had killed his own son and created the very enemy who would eventually blackmail his widow. 2 weeks later, Mrs. Pemberton held a press conference at the Plaza Hotel, with Inspector Kramer and retired FBI agent Brennan in attendance. She announced the establishment of the Vincent Carey Memorial Fund to assist families of merchant mariners killed during World War II, and she publicly acknowledged that her late husband had been involved in espionage activities that contributed to American shipping losses. The story made the front page of 3 newspapers and prompted a congressional investigation into wartime security breaches. Mrs. Pemberton faced some criticism from people who thought she should have protected her husband's reputation, but she also received support from veterans organizations and families of merchant marine casualties. James Garrett and Thomas Kellerman were sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for extortion. Garrett's lawyer tried to paint him as a grieving brother seeking justice, but the judge was unimpressed with his methods. "Mr. Garrett," the judge said during sentencing, "your brother's death was indeed a tragedy caused by treasonous activities, but that tragedy does not give you the right to compound it with extortion and blackmail. If you had taken your evidence to the proper authorities, justice could have been served without adding to the suffering of innocent people." A month after the press conference, Mrs. Pemberton stopped by the brownstone to deliver our final payment and to thank us for our work. She looked years younger than the frightened woman who had first knocked on our door, and there was a strength in her voice that hadn't been there before. "Mr. Wolfe, I want you to know that learning the truth about Harold was the most painful and liberating experience of my life. For 12 years I lived with guilt and shame about something that wasn't my fault. Now I can finally grieve properly for my son and move forward with my life." After she left, Wolfe and I sat in the office enjoying the late afternoon quiet. The case had been satisfying in ways that went beyond our usual fee. We had exposed a blackmailer, cleared a dead man's reputation, and helped a client find peace with a terrible truth. "Archie," Wolfe said, opening his evening beer, "what do you make of Mrs. Pemberton's transformation?" I considered the question. She went from being a victim to being someone who takes responsibility for the truth, even when it hurts. That takes more courage than most people have, indeed, and it illustrates an important principle. Secrets are most dangerous when they are only partially revealed. James Garrett's knowledge was enough to cause harm, but insufficient to ensure justice. Complete exposure, painful as it may be, is often the only path to genuine resolution. You think Mrs. Pemberton did the right thing by going public? I think she did the necessary thing. Vincent Carey died trying to expose Harold Pemberton's crimes. By acknowledging those crimes publicly, Mrs. Pemberton finally allowed Vincent's sacrifice to have meaning. I poured myself a glass of milk and settled back in my desk chair, thinking about the case and its aftermath. In the space of a month, we had unraveled a 12-year-old murder, exposed a wartime espionage ring, caught 2 blackmailers, and helped a client transform from victim to advocate. "One thing still puzzles me," I said. "Why did Garrett think blackmail was a better option than exposure? If he really wanted justice for his brother, why not just reveal Harold's crimes publicly?" "Because blackmail served 2 purposes," Wolfe replied. "It provided financial gain while also inflicting ongoing psychological punishment on Harold's widow. Garrett wanted Eleanor Pemberton to suffer for her husband's crimes, even though she was as much a victim as anyone else. Justice or revenge? Revenge disguised as justice, which is often the most dangerous kind. True justice seeks to right wrongs and restore balance. Revenge seeks only to inflict pain in return for pain received." The phone rang, interrupting our philosophical discussion. It was Inspector Kramer, calling with news about the congressional investigation Mrs. Pemberton's revelations had prompted. "Wolfe," Kramer said, "that Pemberton case you wrapped up has opened a real can of worms. The congressional committee has found evidence of at least 6 other major defense contractors who were selling information to German agents during the war. Looks like Harold Pemberton was part of a much larger conspiracy." "Any arrests pending?" I asked, listening in on the extension. "A few, but most of the main conspirators are dead or have fled the country. The committee is more interested in making sure it doesn't happen again than in prosecuting octogenarians." After Kramer hung up, Wolfe and I discussed the broader implications of what we had uncovered. Harold Pemberton hadn't been an isolated traitor, but part of a network of businessmen who had sold out their country for profit during its darkest hour. "It makes you wonder how many other secrets are buried in government files," I said. "Countless numbers, no doubt. But that is not our concern, Archie. We solve the problems that are brought to our attention, not all the problems that exist in the world." It was a typical Wolfe response, practical, limited in scope, but ultimately wise. We couldn't solve every injustice or right every wrong, but we could handle the cases that came through our door with intelligence, integrity, and determination. As the sun set over Manhattan, I found myself thinking about Vincent Carey and the courage it had taken for him to risk his life trying to expose a treason ring. He had died for his principles, been branded a suicide and potential spy, and remained dishonored for 12 years until we stumbled across the truth. It was a sobering reminder that justice doesn't always arrive on schedule, and that sometimes the most important victories are won long after the heroes are dead. Mrs. Pemberton's case had started as a simple blackmail investigation and evolved into something much larger, a story of wartime betrayal, delayed justice, and the courage required to face uncomfortable truths. In the end, she had chosen truth over comfort, justice over reputation, and responsibility over denial. It was, I reflected, exactly the kind of case that made working for Nero Wolfe worthwhile. We hadn't just caught the bad guys, we had helped restore honor to a forgotten hero, and given a client the strength to confront the darkest chapter of her life. "Archie," Wolfe said, finishing his beer and preparing to leave for dinner, "I believe this case demonstrates why we do this work. Because the money's good. Because the truth matters, even when it arrives 12 years late. Vincent Carey's sacrifice finally has meaning. Eleanor Pemberton can live without shame, and justice, however delayed, has been served." I nodded, understanding what he meant. In a world full of gray areas and moral compromises, it was satisfying to work on a case where right and wrong were clearly defined, even if it took time to sort them out. The next morning brought a new client with a new problem, and the Pemberton case became another file in our cabinet. But I found myself thinking about it often in the weeks that followed, particularly about Mrs. Pemberton's courage in choosing truth over comfort. Most people, when faced with evidence that their loved ones were not who they seemed to be, choose denial or rationalization. Mrs. Pemberton had chosen something much harder: acceptance, responsibility, and action. She had transformed herself from blackmail victim to advocate for justice, and in doing so had finally given Vincent Carey's death the meaning it deserved. It was the kind of moral courage that made our work worthwhile, not just because it helped solve the case, but because it reminded us that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary integrity when circumstances demand it. 3 months later, I read in the newspaper that the Vincent Carey Memorial Fund had raised over $200,000 for merchant marine families. Mrs. Pemberton had turned her private pain into public good, and Vincent Carey's name was finally associated with heroism rather than shame. Justice, as Wolfe had observed, doesn't always arrive on schedule. But sometimes, when it finally shows up, it brings with it a satisfaction that makes the wait worthwhile. I closed the newspaper, filed away the last of the Pemberton case documents, and prepared for whatever mystery would next find its way to our door. In a city full of secrets, there would always be another case, another client, another chance to set things right. But I knew I would remember Eleanor Pemberton and her choice to embrace difficult truths rather than comfortable lies. In the end, that choice had made all the difference, not just for her but for Vincent Carey's memory, for James Garrett's victims, and for everyone who believes that justice, however delayed, is always worth pursuing. After all, if a frightened widow could find the courage to confront her husband's crimes and honor his victim's sacrifice, perhaps there was hope for the rest of us to face our own uncomfortable truths with similar grace. It was exactly the kind of lesson that made working for Nero Wolfe both challenging and rewarding, and exactly the kind of case that reminded me why I wouldn't want to work anywhere else.